Good afternoon and welcome. You have joined the October 26th public information session for the Buffalo Bayou Tributaries Resiliency Study, a feasibility study by the Army Corps of Engineers and Harris County Flood Control District. Thank you for attending this last of 4 virtual sessions. We appreciate your interest in this study. My name is Jen Morgan. I serve as the Outreach Specialist for Project Management in the Galveston District. I will be your facilitator today. Before I introduce our leadership today, I have a few housekeeping items to review. The chat feature is now open to provide your email if you'd like to be added to our email distribution list. Your phone lines are now muted, and please do not unmute your lines so that the meeting runs smoothly. And as another reminder, your webcam is not needed for this meeting. However, we do really value your participation and will be taking questions after today's presentation. As you think of questions about the study or the interim report or something that you might hear, please type them into the chat box. We will collect these questions and later, following the presentation, select questions will be presented to our panel for their comment and responses. How many questions we get to will depend on how much time we have. We will look for your input on the interim feasibility study through November 2nd. Comments can be mailed or emailed to the Corps. We are taking questions through the chat feature today, and then we'll look for your comments by email or mail. Let me now tell you who is here in the room with me. I am joined by Colonel Timothy Vail, Commander of the Galveston District, Mr. Ian Hudson, Program Manager for the Harris County Flood Control District, Brian Harper, the Chief of Planning, Chief of Civil Works for the Corps' Regional Planning and Environmental Center, and Andrew Weber, the study's project manager out of the Galveston District. Colonel Vail, I'll now turn it over to you for opening remarks.
Thanks, Jen, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you for participating in today's public information session and our request for your input on the Buffalo Bayou Tributary Study. Today marks the 4th session that we've engaged with the public, with over 250 active participants so far. We've received hundreds of questions in these sessions and via email, and hundreds more even comments that are both noteworthy and extremely valuable. It's also prompted media discussion already, seeing several news articles on the topic, and continue to promote those ourselves as an invaluable source of input as we continue to scope this project. To the best extent possible, we've tried to incorporate some previous questions into our Andrew Weber's presentation. But all in all, I just very much value your input and feedback. As it was said, I'm Colonel Timothy Vail, and I'm the commander of the Army Corps of Engineers Galveston District, responsible for Army Corps of Engineer activities along the entirety of the Texas coastline from the Rio Grande to the Sabine, spanning 16 different congressional districts and 49 different counties, including Harris County. I'm pleased to be here today with our Corps of Engineer team and our partners from Harris County Flood Control District. Today we're going to present information about the progress of our study with a briefing on the interim report. And that's the report that was released on the 2nd of October. We released that report and are hosting these meetings in advance of our formal draft report, which will include our proposed recommendation, expressly to enlist your feedback to help us address an incredibly complex challenge to reduce flood risk along Buffalo Bayou, with the backdrop of both Hurricane Harvey and the incredible impacts of flooding that occurred on your community, and amidst one of the most active tropical seasons we've seen in the Gulf in a long time. Unlike a formal release of a draft report, which will occur in spring of next year, we're not presenting you with the preferred recommendation. We just aren't there yet. We recognize the need for you to continue to help us by providing input beyond the input you initially provided when we first developed the scope of the study, before we can move forward with our best informed recommendation. Since this is not a formal draft report, while we are actively capturing all of your comments and questions, we will not be hosting a formal comment period in today's call like you'd see with the release of a draft report. Today is more about telling you where we are and largely taking your feedback and then answering your questions. This will allow us to make the best recommendation later on in the process, and it really starts your engagement with us way ahead of the official public comment period that occurs with the release of the draft report next year. At the end of our presentation by our project manager, Andrew Weber, we have a panel assembled here with me to answer the questions that come in through the course of the presentation, and we'll answer those in depth and to the best of our ability. During the presentation or at the conclusion, you have the opportunity to share your questions with our team through the chat feature, and we'll begin answering them at the end of the presentation. First, to provide some context to everything you're going to hear today, I'd like to open with some key points. The Corps of Engineers, sponsored by the Flood Control District, has been conducting this study, analyzing the solutions for both flood risk management and improvements in overall dam safety in order to reduce the risk of flooding and impacts to lives and property along Buffalo Bayou and its tributaries. This study covers both upstream and downstream of the existing Addicks and Barker dams. I want to emphasize that this is not the first time we've studied Buffalo Bayou and its tributaries. The first Corps studies occurred in the 1940s, and those would lead to the construction of Addicks and Barker dams, and they've continued really ever since. This particular study was driven by three distinct observations. First, the changes in development across the watershed have continued to grow year over year. Second, our understanding of how frequent large-scale rainfall events occurs has changed significantly. And third, our understanding of the impacts of those two things was critically sharpened in the catastrophic circumstances of Hurricane Harvey in 2017. However, since 1940, a lot has matured in how we study and develop solutions. Today, more than ever, the Corps must work to build flood resiliency with partnerships across all levels of government and the community. That brings me to this study and the role of partnership going forward. Anything that we recommend in the final study report specific to flood risk management will require a non-federal sponsor in order for us to implement a solution. To get to that point, it's critical that we understand the level of public support for the solutions and specifically what magnitude of solutions are supportable by the public financially. With that said, we can and will recommend dam safety and systems operations improvements to reduce risk on the existing system, but new solutions outside of the dam safety component will require a non-federal sponsor. I do want to assure you that progress across the region has been ongoing since Hurricane Harvey. We're well underway on multiple Bayou Channel improvement projects with the Flood Control District elsewhere, and we're largely complete constructing new water release structures at both dams that make their operations significantly safer for decades to come. I want to stress that this is not the only opportunity for public input. Tonight and the comment period throughout the interim report is in advance of the formal comment period for the draft report and environmental impact statement. Again, we're trying to push as much information to you ahead of that formal process so that you can continue to provide us input before we have to make a recommendation, and so that you're well versed on the project so as to be well suited to make formal public comments when we release that recommendation in the spring of next year. I want to stress, to date we have not found easy answers. We must evaluate every alternative in four critical areas. First, the effectiveness in reducing risk to life and property. Second, the technical feasibility. Will our solution actually work? Third, the economic feasibility. Is it really justifiable in terms of the cost? And then fourth, the corresponding effects on both the environmental and social resources to make sure it's consistent with our values and federal laws. As such, it's imperative that we get your input on this study and your feedback in each of those critical areas. So please stay in touch with us through our website. And at this point, I'd like to introduce our project sponsor, Harris County Flood Control District. Thank you, Colonel Vail, for the introduction. Again, my name is Ian Hudson. I'm with Harris County Flood Control District, and I'm here today on behalf of Russ Poppy, our Executive Director, who cannot attend. Before the Corps of Engineers begins its presentation today, I'd like to tell you briefly about Harris County Flood Control District and its role in this study. I'll start with who we are. The Flood Control District is a special purpose district created by the state legislature in 1937. Not long after the floods that you saw on the slides that Colonel Vail was discussing just a moment ago. Our history generally parallels that Colonel Vail discussed. Originally, our primary purpose was to serve as the local sponsor for major Corps of Engineers projects in the region. But today, the district is more broadly responsible for devising and implementing flood damage reduction plans across Harris County. Our infrastructure includes about 2,500 miles of open channel and more than 200 stormwater detention basins countywide. Partnership projects with the Corps are an important part of how the Flood Control District delivers on its mission. Since the 1980s, the Corps and the Flood Control District have invested over $1 billion in federal projects that have substantially reduced flood risks in several watersheds across Harris County. We currently have 5 of those projects under construction, and 4 of those are nearing completion. So the study that we're discussing with you today sets the framework for the next phase of our partnership with the Corps. This brings me to our roles for this study. The Corps has owned, operated, and maintained the Addicks and Barker reservoirs since they were constructed in the 1940s. Because the existing reservoirs are the focal point of this study, the Corps is the study lead. The Flood Control District is the study sponsor because it is responsible for the creeks and bayous upstream and downstream of the reservoirs. This responsibility gives us a vested interest in the alternatives that are being proposed to further reduce flood risks. The Flood Control District's role to date has been to monitor and provide input on the direction and progress of the study, provide supporting information, and provide technical and review and comment on the Corps' work when requested. Moving forward, our role will be to work with the Corps to identify a plan that is consistent with community and natural values, which it ties in with the Flood Control District's mission statement. This is why your participation in this meeting and the public comment period is so important. We encourage everyone who lives or works in the study area to read the interim report, participate in a meeting like you're doing now, and submit written comments to the Corps via the contact information on their study webpage. The goal of this process is to comprehensively gauge public sentiments at this time. And as you read through the materials and submit your comments, we encourage you to remember the impact and scale of Hurricane Harvey 3 years ago as you consider the alternatives. In closing, I should also be clear that the Flood Control District's 2018 bond program does not include funding to construct any of the alternatives that are currently being considered, and thus any local match that would be required to construct a project would need to be funded through other means. So with that, I will thank the Corps for partnership on this study and being here today, and thank you, the public, for your attendance in this meeting and your participation in the process, and I'll hand it back to Jen.
Thank you. I'd now like to reintroduce Brian Harper as Director of Civil Works for the Corps' Regional Planning and Environmental Center, and I turn it over to you for opening remarks also.
Thank you, Jen. So Colonel Vail and Ian covered the intro remarks pretty well. I did just want to add a couple of things. The step we're taking here with this interim report is not a typical part of the Corps' process. Ordinarily at this time, we would have a draft report with recommendations. So why are we releasing an interim report? Well, as the Colonel and Ian said, we need to hear from the public, from our stakeholders, about the options that are on the table. That's a normal part of our process, our scoping phase, but we're extending the scoping phase in this study because of the particular challenges that we face here. The dams at Addicks and Barker have done well since they were constructed 75 years ago. They provided over $26 billion in benefits and damage reduction benefits. But as Harvey reminded us, we still have a substantial risk issue, flood risk issue, when we face these large flood events. We've had floods in 15, 16, and 17 that have illustrated for us how precipitation patterns are changing and flood risks are changing. And public safety is a priority for us, and we feel it's absolutely necessary that we make a recommendation for what's the best long-term flood risk answer that we can provide out of this study. What's that recommendation? Well, these options we have and the recommendations we have don't neatly fit into typical Corps of Engineers policies and procedures. So, you know, it requires a larger discussion with the public, with the stakeholders, with our sponsors at Harris County Flood Control District in order for us to form those recommendations that will come in that draft report next year. So that's why we're taking this step. So again, we just encourage you, please share your voice with us so that we can factor that into the work that we're doing, and our report next year with our recommendations will reflect that input. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Harper. Andrew Weber serves as project manager for the study. I'd now like to turn it over to Mr. Weber for a presentation.
All right. Well, howdy. My name is Andrew Weber, and I am the project manager for this study. I am pleased to have the opportunity today to present some of the work that the study team has been doing. I'm going to talk some about the history leading up to this study and give an overview of the study's purpose. Then I'm going to dive into the interim report and some of the alternatives that we've looked at. Throughout, I'm going to reiterate the importance of your participation and continued interest in the study. And then I'll close with a look at the next steps as we proceed towards a final report and potentially construction. We've already mentioned the devastating floods that occurred in the 1920s and 30s. They were the catalyst towards federal involvement in flood risk management on Buffalo Bayou. That involvement took the form of the Buffalo Bayou and Tributaries project. What you see on the screen before you is the original project plan, circa 1939. Our partners, Harris County Flood Control District, was originally formed to partner with the Corps for this project. This comprehensive plan was a combination of storage and conveyance measures to keep floodwaters away from the city of Houston. It was not fully constructed. Of this plan, only Addict and Barker dams and about 8 miles of improvement on main stem Buffalo Bayou were completed. You can see those on the screen circled in blue. However, many features were not built. You can see those circled in red. There's a levee on Cypress Creek, meant to keep overflow from that watershed from entering Addict Dam. The South Canal, originally meant to divert water from the dams around the city, was never built. Nor was a third reservoir and bypass canal for White Oak Bayou. It's a common question to ask. Why weren't they built? Following World War II, land prices increased, and these features were deemed too expensive. Congress didn't appropriate funds for their construction, and they were never built. This plan still gets brought up, though, as a regional blueprint for flood risk management in Houston. However, development since then has made these features obsolete. One final point on this slide. You may have heard discussion of a third reservoir. This concept is not the one shown on this plan on White Oak Bayou. The modern third reservoir, that we'll discuss more a little later, is located on Cypress Creek in the vicinity of where the levee is shown on this plan. Houston is located on a flat coastal plain and is no stranger to flooding. Still, in August of 2017, Hurricane Harvey hit Houston with unprecedented rainfall. Addict and Barker both set new records for full elevation and storage, almost doubling the previous record set only a year before during the tax day flood. Addict and Barker dams were completed in the 1940s and have since prevented over $26 billion in damages downstream. When constructed, They were located 10 to 15 miles west of Houston. Over time, Houston has grown. By the 1990s, Houston had reached the downstream face of the dam, and by 2016, the reservoirs were completely encircled by development. This change in land use creates two issues that drive the need for this study. The first is related to how much water and how quickly it arrives at the reservoir. Development upstream increases the amount of land that is impervious, increasing runoff and the demand on the creeks and bayous that feed into the reservoir. This leads to more total water reaching the dams and the reservoirs filling up faster. The second issue is the increased presence of life and property upstream of the dam and along Buffalo Bayou. The change in land use has created a constrained system. During large events, on the scale of Hurricane Harvey or larger, if the dam holds too much water, the pool level will exceed government-owned land. Release too much water, and there will be impacts downstream. Hurricane Harvey was the first time that we really experienced this constrained system. Water in the reservoirs extended off of government-owned land, and to prevent water from going around the dams in an uncontrolled manner, the dam's surcharge release schedule was activated, and the gates on the dams were opened well beyond normal operating limits. The chart on this slide shows the three top pools for both dams. As you can see, Hurricane Harvey brought a massive amount of water. There are limits to the existing system, and Hurricane Harvey is by no means a worst-case scenario for rainfall in Houston. During a spillway design flood, reservoir pool elevations would be 6 or 7 feet higher than Hurricane Harvey, and the dams would hold back almost half again as much water. Following Harvey, the U.S. Congress funded the Buffalo Bayou and Tributaries Resiliency Study. This study is authorized by Section 216 of the Flood Control Act of 1970. This authorization allows the Corps of Engineers to review completed flood risk management projects where there have been significant changes to physical and economic conditions. In this case, the extensive development and change of land use in the watershed. This is a $6 million study being completed at 100% federal expense. Funds are provided through the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, passed following Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, and it waives the normal 50% local study cost share. Our study partner is the Harris County Flood Control District. Flood risk management is a coordinated effort across all levels of government. One of the goals of this study is to identify and evaluate ways to reduce flood risk both upstream and downstream of the dam. The map on this slide shows our study area. As you can see, it's a bit broader than the Attic, Barker, and Buffalo Bayou watersheds. We are also including Upper Cypress Creek watershed, where when the creek rises to a certain level, it starts to overflow into the Attic watershed. We have also included White Oak and Braid Bayous in our study areas. Please note, we are not looking for ways to further reduce flooding on these bayous. Both White Oak and Braid Bayous have currently ongoing construction projects that are partnered projects between the Corps and the Flood Control District. They were included in this study for two reasons. One is as a potential means of conveyance for water from the dam, and two, to evaluate if study alternatives had impact to these immediately adjacent and connected watersheds. The second goal of the study is to evaluate the dams for their continued structural integrity into the future, focusing on the uncontrolled spillway. To provide some context for that second study goal, the Corps maintains a dam safety program as part of its role as a responsible dam owner and operator. This program extends from the daily routine of on-site dam personnel to annual inspections of the dam by qualified staff to a re-evaluation of the dam's design and risk at alternating 5-year intervals by professional engineers. As a part of this routine program, the Corps identified potential failure risks at the dam's main outlet work and uncontrolled spillways. At this point, I want to stress that neither dam is in imminent danger of failure. I also want to stress the definition of risk. Risk is the product of the likelihood of something bad happening and the consequences that occur if it does. In the case of Addicks and Barker dams, the likelihood of failure is low, but there are over 1 million people who live downstream, meaning consequences could be high. To address the potential failure mechanism at the dam outlet structures, the Corps has an ongoing $82 million contract to install additional seepage control measures and to build new outlet control structures at both dams. The map on this screen orients you to the location of this ongoing work. The new structure at Barker can easily be seen when traveling on Highway 6, and at Addicks, briefly visible when traveling westbound on I-10. I'm calling your attention to these now to distinctively separate this from the uncontrolled spillways we'll talk about more a little later on. So if you've joined more than one of these, you'll notice that the previous slide and this slide have been reconfigured a bit. We received a lot of feedback on these two slides, and people really wanted to be able to better see these pictures. The pictures at left show the status of construction in April of 2019. The work area is behind a protective cofferdam. The primary dam embankment has been degraded, and in these pictures you can see the mass concrete work in progress. They're setting up forms for the new gate towers and still basement. The pictures at right show both outlet structures complete and operational, with the primary dam embankment restored and the cofferdam removed. Amazing what a year will do. If you look to the far left of the newer attic structure, you can see the old structure that is being replaced. These new structures are improved in almost every measurable way. The outlet works have been completed and operational at both dams since this March. The last cutoff wall was completed in August, and we expect the contract to be fully completed this year. I last stood in front of you during a public scoping period back in May of 2019. There I asked for your ideas on how to address flooding and for your local knowledge to better improve how we develop solutions. After reviewing your comments, the Corps study team has been developing the ideas presented then into concepts that can be quantitatively evaluated and compared. The Corps has conducted extensive hydraulic and hydrological modeling, something that I'll refer to later on in this presentation as H&H for short. Engineers have sized alternatives and developed rough costs, and with these fleshed out concepts, the study team can evaluate them for public safety benefits, assess them for impacts to the environment, as well as communities, and evaluate those options for financial investment. Please note the blue text. The study started during scoping, seeking input from the public, and now with the release of the interim report, we're looking forward to sharing the work completed to date and receiving more of your input prior to publishing a recommended plan. And that brings us to today. On October 2nd, the Corps released an interim report. This report provides you with a summary of all the analysis completed to date. It allows you to see what ideas have been screened out and what remains under consideration for recommendation. And perhaps most importantly, it allows the public an extra opportunity to provide your thoughts to the Corps before it makes a recommendation. The interim report is an additional step in the study process, but one that the Corps and Flood Control District feel is very important before a recommendation is made. All of the alternatives under consideration are large, expensive, and will impact various community interests. They are sized for larger, less frequent events, but none, even in combination, completely eliminate the flooding issues for the watershed. This is why your comments are so important. Let the Corps, the Flood Control District, and your elected leaders know what your priorities are. The next part of this brief will provide an overview of the formulation and analysis the study team has completed, and an introduction to the alternatives, as well as some preliminary findings. Before proceeding, let me explain some flooding terms. You may have heard some of these before. Recurrence intervals, annual exceedance probability, or maybe even something like a 100-year flood. These are all terms used to describe the likelihood of flood. That means a 100-year flood doesn't really mean once every 100 years. It means there is a 1% chance each and every year that a flood of that magnitude happens. The table on this slide provides you a cheat sheet to correlate these terms. Between scoping and the release of the interim report, the study team has been doing what the Corps calls formulation. What you see before you is a list of questions that we try to answer during this phase. We leave scoping with a bunch of ideas. Next, we ask ourselves, how likely is it to work? Now, if it's something that might work, is it something that's technically feasible? Is it something we can design? Is it something we can build? Then we assess economic feasibility. Is it cost effective? Is it an efficient use of the taxpayers' dollars? We also consider the effect a given course of action would have to the environment and to the community. Before I leave this slide, I'd like to talk a bit more about economic feasibility. This metric carries a lot of weight traditionally with flood risk management studies and is typified in the benefit to cost ratio, or BCR. It's a ratio of the expected benefits or reduced damage expected over the life of a project, typically a period of 50 years. This is compared to the expected construction, operations, and maintenance costs over the same period. These costs are annualized. And this annualization is very important because it factors in how likely any given level of flooding is to occur. In this type of analysis, an event like Hurricane Harvey doesn't really register because it is not very likely to occur during that 50-year period of analysis. That is problematic for this study because the benefits of more frequent events, like a 50 or 100-year flood, are already captured largely by the existing dams, leading to low BCRs for the alternatives in this study. However, this study is also looking at a life safety metric. In this type of analysis, the alternatives are looked at under peak loading and modeled to predict if they produce any change to the expected life safety in a given scenario. With this type of analysis, we are able to take into consideration events like Hurricane Harvey and larger. For this study to recommend a plan, we expect to blend these analyses along with our evaluation of environmental and community impact in your input. Formulation is an iterative process. During this process, as analyses are completed, measures and alternatives that appear less effective are screened out so that resources can be focused on developing those alternatives with the greatest potential. At each successive level, more detail is added to the remaining alternatives, and the process is repeated until a final recommendation is made. The previous slide discussed the framework that the study conducted formulation within. I'm now going to run through what that looks like for this study and familiarize you with some of the terms in the interim report. Our focus was to find something we called an anchor measure. To be an anchor measure, it had to be able to have system-wide impact to flood risk. It would be something that would, in and of itself, provide the majority of benefits available within the watershed. Measures that had potential to provide only localized benefits were labeled as ancillary. This initial sorting was done mainly through engineering judgment. But remember, the planning process is iterative. As we started to get results of preliminary H&H modeling, some of the measures were reclassified as ancillary. They just didn't have the impact we thought they would. We then took these measures and built them into alternatives. Each alternative is built around an anchor, and each anchor was supplemented by an assortment of ancillary measures that drive flood risk even lower. We were then able to conduct more detailed H&H modeling, and as engineers completed cost estimates, we were able to begin economic and life safety analyses. We found that these comprehensive alternatives were producing very low benefit to cost ratios. So we then performed an incremental analysis comparing the comprehensive alternative to a standalone anchor-only alternative and found that the ancillary features greatly increased costs but did not have comparable impact to flood damage reduction. This led to the screening out of all ancillary measures and to the study's final array of alternatives. At this point, I want to talk in detail on one concept that has received a lot of attention since Harvey. The increase to storage capacity at the existing dams by mass excavation on government-owned land, essentially by removing soil to make room for additional water. We originally had high expectations for this concept. It started out as an anchor measure. However, as analyses progressed, we found that the potential of this measure was limited. A high water table in the area limits how deep the existing land can be excavated. The water table must be avoided, otherwise, any excavation would permanently hold water and not provide additional storage capacity during a rainfall event. Also, to increase the capacity at both dams by just 15% would require the excavation of almost 50 million cubic yards of soil. To put that into perspective, that much soil would fill the Astrodome almost 35 times. This concept has substantial environmental impact, as it involves essentially strip mining the targeted area, likely permanently destroying the habitat there. Our analysis showed that moving that much soil only provides localized benefits immediately upstream of the dams themselves. That led this concept to be downgraded to an ancillary measure and screened from the study entirely. Excuse me. Now for the remaining alternatives. I will start with the no action alternative today. Another term, seen on this slide's graphic and in the report, is future without project. They essentially mean the same thing. As part of the study, we forecast conditions 50 years into the future, attempting to account for population changes and future development. This assumes no new action is undertaken from this study, and that Addicks and Barker dams would remain in place in their current form. This forms the baseline that all of the other alternatives will be compared against. The graphic on this slide shows what we would expect to be inundated given different frequency floods in the no action scenario. Each of the other alternatives are measured by how much they lower flooding in the community and therefore safety risks and property damages during future floods compared to this baseline. In the no action alternative, we would expect to see almost $192 million in average annual damages into the future and no change in the life safety analysis. This would be the default recommendation if federal interest cannot be found, or if the local community was not interested in further pursuing any of the alternatives.
Can you talk about, in any detail, how any Katy Prairie Conservancy lands might be impacted with a new dam in that area?
So with all the properties potentially upstream of a third reservoir, it's going to depend on their proximity to the deepest points in the reservoir. Yes, we expect it to perform similarly to Addicks and Barker. So the areas closest to the outlet works will see pools more frequently and of longer duration. And really the key consideration there is how long will a pool exist and how deep. And so we would expect areas closest to the reservoir to be most impacted, and areas further away and at the fringe to have minimal or no impacts.
This is a question about the draft report for when it is released. Will the draft report include the measures that will not be further considered, such as reservoir excavations?
So in the draft report, well, let's start with the interim report. The interim report is an update on what we've done to date. It's a snapshot of where we are today, or perhaps more accurately on October 2nd. In the draft report, what you can expect to see is more information, more technical information. A lot of that will be codified into appendices and available for your review. But our screening process, how we go through formulation, is that once a concept is screened from further consideration, we don't continue to build on it. We take the time, money, personnel, and take that to further refine the things that are on the table. So in the draft report, I would expect that there would be more details available on perhaps some of our sizing and analysis, but you won't see anything new as of October 2 or later.
Thank you. This question asks, would there be heightened flood possibilities or risk during an actual period of construction?
Was that asked in reference to a particular alternative?
Just in general.
In general, no. If you look at the channel improvement options, you know, the Corps and the Flood Control District have a lot of experience doing that in the region. You know, Prairie, White Oak, Sims. How those typically proceed is from a downstream point to an upstream point, so that the improvements are additive, and you don't see a transference of risks where an improved section meets up with an unimproved section. If the structural alternative is a reservoir, you know, a lot of it would be built up to a point where, you know, it would actually impact natural flows for a brief amount of time. That'd probably be the last bit of the reservoir to be built to close that off and to make sure that impacts of that nature don't occur.
Thank you. In regards to non-federal sponsors, can you give us an example of who would be a possible or an appropriate non-federal sponsor?
Well, the Corps has a long partnership with the Harris County Flood Control District. Right now they are the study sponsors for Buffalo Bayou trips. You know, they have to work through their own process. You know, we'd love to continue our relationship in this manner, but you know, they're one possible implementing agency. There are others. Any government entity that has the authority to levy a tax can be a implementing sponsor with the Corps of Engineers. That could be the county, the element, the state, other entities or special use entities that could have this interest. That's a ongoing process that will occur as this study. I'm going to kick that over to.
No, I'll take it. I'm seeing a lot of questions roll in that are surrounding this question. So I just want to give you the status of the current law and policy as it pertains to this study and where we're going. Current law and policy would require us, in order to move forward with implementation of a design and construction solution, to have a non-federal partner or a non-federal sponsor for design and construction. And the non-federal sponsor would be required on every single one of the alternatives presented to you to fund 35% of the costs of all of the alternatives, any of the alternatives that were presented to you. And the non-federal sponsor's requirement under current law and policy is to, as part of that 35% cost, additionally come up with all of the real estate and rights of entry requirements that the Corps would need for the actual construction of the project. So, for example, for the upstream real estate acquisitions, that would require a non-federal partner to proceed with the acquisitions upstream. On the downstream side, in terms of the real estate acquisitions for widening a channel, that would require a non-federal sponsor to facilitate and to negotiate for those real estate acquisitions and provide the Corps of Engineers the lands on which to widen the channel. In the event of the construction of a dam upstream, the non-federal sponsor would not only need to acquire the real estate, furnish 35% of the construction costs, but also, in accordance with current law and policy, be responsible for the operations and maintenance of that dam. As it stands, that's why we need so much of your public input, because that's a pretty heavy lift, not just for Harris County, but for the people of Harris County to sign up for. Where would that money come from a non-federal sponsor? I don't want to steal from Mr. Hudson, but generally comes from bond programs in that regard, or state level funding, or some sort of grant program. It doesn't necessarily have to be Harris County Flood Control District, but Harris County Flood Control District, this is generally Harris County's area of responsibility in that regard. What we're dealing with is trying to understand where the public, so we want you to inform us in terms of what's that financial burden that you're willing to support to reduce flood risk within the Addison, Barker, and Buffalo Bayou watershed, with the understanding, again, that those two dams that have been first envisioned in 1940 provide an incredible level of protection compared to other watersheds in Harris County. You got to recognize that those two dams provide an incredible level of protection as it stands right now. And what is the benefit to cost that you're willing to support, the life safety reduction that you're willing to support, given that current law and policy requires the public, through a non-federal sponsor, to shoulder 35% of those costs. Notwithstanding, law and policy can change. We're not ignorant that law and policy can change, and often change, and the federal government could be authorized with a fully federal project and appropriated for a fully federal project, but that is not the current state of law and policy. Anything to add, Mr. Harper?
No, sir. Again, you covered that very well.
Okay. Ian?
Yeah, I would just add that although others could be implementing non-federal sponsors, like you said, Harris County is our area of responsibility, and so our expectation is that the Corps is going to be looking to the Flood Control District first as an implementing non-federal sponsor, and so our objective through this process is to identify what's supported by the public, what's implementable and affordable for both parties, the federal government and at the local level, because that is our expectation moving forward. That we've partnered on many other projects and studies, and we see this no differently. Of course, at this time, we're just the study sponsor, but we have to look forward and know that we're arriving at something that we could work together as an implementing sponsor.
Yeah. I think that's important. Just as you're reviewing the interim report and the presentation that Mr. Weber gave you, just considering your comments and feedback this scale. Perhaps one of the alternatives at a smaller scale, you have input on that. By all means, those are incredibly valuable to us.
On a similar topic.
What I will say is that as an agency, we strongly favor infrastructure that operates passively, namely gravity flow. We generally try to avoid infrastructure that has to be managed and operated, operational decisions having to be made. So I won't say that it's off the table. Nothing is off the table at this point. But we do have a strong preference for infrastructure that operates by gravity on its own.
Thank you. Questions for Mr. Weber? Somebody asks, was there consideration given to using strategically located lift stations to help prevent flooding?
So I would assume that question would come along with pump stations. One thing that the Corps and the Flood Control District agree on is that there's a huge cost implementation to doing projects that are not gravity fed. I can't say that that's a concept that I heard before today or during previous scoping.
Okay, thank you. For alternative 7, with land acquisition, will the acquisition of land upstream of the reservoirs continue to be studied?
So the short answer is yes. The Addison Barker dams, they're so big, they're almost like a heat sink. Options that are upstream of the dams tend to have limited downstream impacts just because of the storage and holding capacity of the dams. And the same way that alternatives downstream of the dams have little impacts to the upstream floodway risk. So both of those are different ways to approach very different portions of the flood risk in the overall watershed.
Thank you. The next question is regarding channel improvement. Is the Corps committed to only undertaking this project if the entire length of the path is done, or is there some kind of scenario where maybe only the west end of the project would be completed? This concern around the villages.
So there's a couple pieces to that question that I want to hit on. One is on scalability. The Colonel's already touched on this some. What we've outlined, the 15,000 CFS, that's kind of the upper bracket of what we've looked at. You know, that we use that both to try to put an upper end to the reductions we can see, to maximize what we think the potential impacts to the environment and community could be. But again, we want to work with the public, the local agencies to look at scalability, what is implementable. And so if a decrease in capacity, and I'm throwing out numbers here, from 15,000 to 10,000, if that's a agreeable scenario and reduces impacts and we don't have to touch all pieces of the channel, you know, that's definitely a potential path forward from this point. The other part of that question was, would we just want to do the west end perhaps? And that kind of feeds into another question we got, is that we don't want to spot treat this and create risk elsewhere. So if that were to, for the only way for that to come to be would have to be through analysis that showed that that can be effective at a certain scale and not increase flood risk elsewhere in the watershed.
Yeah, I think it's important to say neither the Corps nor the Harris County Flood Control District design and construct projects that transfer risk. We both have policies that require us to limit the inducement of damages. For any work that we do, say upstream, we have to keep downstream impacts to a minimum. So we can't transfer risk from one area to another. Anything to add on that, Ian?
No, that's absolutely true, and that's evaluated for all of the alternatives moving forward. Now that isn't to say that would preclude scaling or looking at different reaches, but that consideration would just have to be taken into account in the analysis.
Okay, thank you. We have just a few minutes left, and I think I can probably take 2 more questions. Mr. Weber, maybe you can help us out. A few people have asked, where can the public find historical and more current rainfall statistics?
So my first recommendation would be to refer you to the report. We do have some of that in the interim report. I would expect there to be quite a bit more when we release the draft report, and there's a full H&H appendix. In the meantime, if you don't want to flip through that report or don't want to wait for the draft report, I would strongly suggest that you Google NOAA Atlas 14, NOAA Atlas 14, and there's a lot of publicly available information on that new data set. Ian, do you have anything on that?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. The No Atlas 14 report is out there, and just to answer part of that question, generally for our region, we're seeing rainfall rates for any particular intensity and duration going up on the order of about 30% for any given event, old versus new. So that's the rough magnitude of the increase in the rainfall rates that study is finding.
Thank you. And the final question I would like to direct to Mr. Harper. If the decision is to not move forward with any study recommendations and accept risk as is, what would be required to trigger a future Corps of Engineers study to reassess?
Well, so that's actually a pretty big hurdle for us to clear. I mean, so it would feed back into standard budget processing where the district, usually in response to a request from a local sponsor, would submit a proposal to start a new study. So if Harris County Flood Control District decided at a future date that it was an appropriate time to reinvestigate solutions here, they would submit a proposal to us. We would include that with our annual budgeting requests, and we would essentially join the line, the queue, and the competition for a limited number of new study starts that are initiated by the administration. So, sir, I see you.
Well, no, I just want to add again, Corps of Engineers is a dynamic agency by all means, but we deliver with our sponsor. We recognize the Harris County Flood Control District as the flood control district, partner for Harris County, whether through all of the watersheds. Again, I'm very happy that we're working together on our regional watershed assessment, which will, to some extent, be our blessing to, say, different coalitions, different smaller flood district capacities and utility mud districts that are out there, in terms of giving them some sort of wherewithal in terms of what they can do to risk flooding at the local level. But generally, the Corps, for further analysis, would look to Harris County Flood Control District, or if nothing else, make sure anybody that would approach us asking for another study is going through Harris County Flood Control District. Otherwise, it's too easy to get everything kind of mixed up in that regard.
Okay, thank you. We are very near out of time. I'd like to thank everyone for your attendance and your questions today. We apologize for not being able to get to all of the questions. We probably have 50 or more questions still out there. But as a reminder, we will be using these questions to update our frequently asked questions document on our website. So please do look for that in the coming week with some more information. And we do understand that this is a lot of information. As we move through the study process, we will continue to find ways to get more information to you. Okay, I'd like to remind everyone
Hey,
that...
Jen, I'll just summarize again. So keep your comments coming. Obviously, the sooner the better, but keep them coming. It's, this very distinct period of introducing the interim report to you is going to come to a conclusion. And we're going to move forward with the study. We haven't laid out the exact way to continue to interact with you, but feel free to continue to provide your comments to us beyond the 2nd of November. But the 2nd of November is key to us in terms of knowing that we're moving out of this phase of introducing the interim report, and now we're refining the interim report and finishing the scoping and getting to a recommended alternative. There will be a time and an opportunity, and we'll continue to communicate with you, where we potentially can share more updated information going forward, but that's to be determined as we go forward. I'm thinking we may do additional open houses as we get closer and closer to that recommended alternative. But we'll keep you posted as we go through that on our website. The goal is everybody that's participating. We're now with today's numbers, almost 1,000 people that have read the report and have very distinct and pointed questions. It's our responsibility to continue to provide good government to you by providing you an opportunity to provide information to us and to share with you where we're at. So I would anticipate that we'll do another open house at some point prior to the actual release of the draft EIS, and then that way you're informed and in the best position possible to provide your formal input and comments under the National Environmental Policy Act when the draft EIS is released next spring. So just stay tuned in that regard.
Okay. Any other closing remarks?
No, I just appreciate it. Turn it over to Ian.
Colonel, I would just say, on behalf of Flood Control, thank you for the Corps' willingness to continue to accept comments and consider them after the end of the formal end of the comment period on November 2nd. This study is addressing a really tough problem. We're looking at important decisions to make that will have impacts spanning generations, and so we want to get this right. And so again, thank you for the willingness to consider comments past that deadline, and to the public again for your participation in the process. Like I said, there's no easy solution to the problem, and so the public support for whatever is recommended moving forward is a key component to all of this. So thank you for your input.
Okay. Thank you. And with that, it's now after 3 o'clock, and we will be closing the phone lines.